Good evening to all of you. That was pretty bad. No, that's fine. No, that's fine. Get your snacks. All right. Tell the person sitting beside you who you saw today. Make sure the grocery order's put in. All that. I'll give you a minute or two to relax, and then we can do it. It was pretty deficient in our greeting right there. We'll try it again. All right. Good evening. Nah, it's fake. Y'all didn't mean any of that either. You were just trying to show off then. Tonight, we are going to be in predominantly the book of Mark, a little bit of the book of John, but you can also go to Matthew or to Luke, and you'll be able to find this as well. So we'll be in a lot of different places, I guess, from time to time. But Mark, and in particular, Mark chapter 11, as we said last week, these last week of Jesus' life lessons, most of what we study is actually going to be in the last chapter or two of each of the Gospels as well. The exception tonight will be John, and we'll talk a little bit about that here as we go forward. But tonight we're going to be talking about, and I think we'll be able to cover this in one evening here this evening, is the finding of Jesus, and we're talking about the Moneychangers, okay? And we'll look into that a little bit more. We've titled it for tonight, Lesson 2, Jesus Cleanses the Temple. And so, like I said, we're going to work out of the book of Mark to start with, and then we'll go to the book of John after that. As way of introduction, we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, Jesus's last week. And when Jesus rode in Jerusalem on the first day of the week, he then enters into the temple. And I believe Ben last week, we talked about the temple and how they had the gates and things were set up, the courts to have to pass or to keep people from being able to pass through. This is a model of the temple. It's in Israel now. It's not a real it's a real thing, but it's not. It's sort of made to scale of what it would be like. But you could go and visit this. But this is the temple. And you may remember a few years back, 2 or 3 years back, we talked about the temple. I think Ben has done something maybe more recently than that, talking about the temple as well. But what was the temple to the people of Jerusalem? The dwelling place of God and the starting point. But what else was it, even maybe not even totally religious? It was their identity as a people. There was sort of the town square of it, maybe, where people sort of came together, where you might have crossed paths with people. So there was a religious aspect to this, but there was a sort of cultural and a social aspect to the temple as well. And so when Jesus will go into the city, and we're going to be in day 2 tonight, but that would be the place where you would start. It would make sense that you would go into that place. And after looking around and healing the blind and the lame, he then returns to Bethany in the evening. And that was on the first day. And we talked a bit about that in the last week or so. Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about the second day, the second day. Several things are happening. We're not going to spend as much time on some of these things except for the Moneychangers, but Jesus pronounced judgment on the unproductive fig tree. You may remember just a couple of months ago when we were finishing up our miracle story. That was one of the things that we talked about. You sensed a bit of frustration in Jesus. You may remember that he saw that tree from afar, and it looked like what would be a good snack or a good place to rest, and it ended up not being any of that. He'll end up then going into the temple, and we'll see more about that in just a second, and casting out the merchandisers. So sometimes you'll see that word used rather than money changers. And then at the end, he and his disciples will leave the city, return to the Mount of Olives in the evening. And so we've got pictures there of a fig tree at the top, a little artistic rendering of Jesus and the merchandisers or the money changers, and then a picture of the Mount of Olives today. All right. But let's talk about money changers for just a second. And I know that's not going to be real big, but I wanted the picture to show up there pretty good for us. But Jesus and his disciples have journeyed to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast in obedience to the law. Every male among the Jews was required to attend this feast in Jerusalem every year. So we're talking about a sizable amount of people. What can we maybe relate to that we have to do every year? Is there anything that we as a group or an entity, not even just Christianity, but in community, have to do every year? Pay taxes, all right? That's something that we would all have to do. Well, we mail them in, now or mail in the forms, but that's something that everybody has to do. What's something else that we might all have to do? Is there anything else? Die. We'll all have to die every year, Don. That's a man. I guess I didn't like my death this year. We'll try it again next year. We'll try and do it better. But what's that? License our vehicles. There's some court things that we would have to do, but even like a driver's license is only every few years. The vehicle and the taxes and the tags on them. But we don't have a whole lot of things that we all have to do. But when you do have to do something like that, it might be going to pay taxes, or it might be going to license your vehicle, it might be going to vote. You'll probably see people that you know. You may utter the word, "I've not seen you in a year," or maybe, "I've not seen you since the last time that we did this." Well, you can imagine that this appearance that Jesus makes at the Passover feast, there's going to be a lot of people there that they know, right? But maybe a lot of people that you've not come into contact with. And so while this is a religious thing, it can't help but be a sort of social thing for people to get to gather together. How are you? What have you done? All of this. Well, what we're going to be looking at here is some other people that would have been there as well. And when Jesus goes into the temple on the second day, he found in the outer court of the temple, which is called the court of the Gentiles, a market for buying and selling animals needed for sacrifice. And so there were animals that had to be sacrificed, and you had to provide that. So explain to me why there might be a market off to the side where one could buy or sell those animals. Tom. It might not have been feasible to have brought your sacrificial animals a long distance. Why else would it maybe be there? You might not have had an animal that met the requirements for the sacrifice. What else? Sometimes it's just easier to do it there, right? The ball game starts in an hour, and we could cook here at home, but do we have time, or could we just get a hot dog at the game, right? Well, why do we sometimes get a hot dog at the game? It's there, and it's convenient. You got to pay for it, but it's there, and it's convenient. And the same reason could be for people coming in to buy one of these sacrificial animals. And so these money changers or merchandisers, or whatever word you want to use, sort of play that role of someone involved in the buying and the selling. There was tables for money changers who exchanged Roman coins for Jewish coins, because all Jews were required to pay a half shekel, which is a Jewish coin, each year for the service of the temple. So you got people there that are prepared to say, "I can help you out with this situation, and I can help you out with what you have to pay." Well, there are people at all the banks in town that can help you out with things as well. We've been talking about this in my government classes here in the last couple of days, but if you go and borrow money, you will have to pay it back plus what? If you borrow $1,000, you don't have to pay back 1,000. You got to pay back 1,000, a little bit more, right? And if you borrow 100,000, you got to pay a lot more back, as it were. But money changers play that sort of lender loaner exchange rate as well. Boo, I know you all have been to several countries. Do you try to use local money when you go to those places, or is there? So if you didn't hear, she's been to a few different countries, and she said in the past you would exchange to get Italian money or Greek money or whatever it might be. But now places more credit cards, not as much cash. But when you go to exchange money, if you're trying to exchange, dollars and, coins or whatever, there's usually a fee that goes with that as well. And usually the rate is pretty steep, but they can do that because what do you need? You need that money. And so when the money changers are there, when you're there and you need this Jewish coin, you need this half shekel for service of the temple, well, there's somebody there that can help you. It's going to cost you a little bit extra. So what are the people that are lending out the money or changing out the money? What are they making in all of this? They're making a profit out of this. This is a good way to make money. You've got a captive audience. It's a good way to make money. Now, this is not going to set well with Jesus here in just a second. Yeah. So, right. So even using a credit card, there's a fee that would maybe be applied from other places. Mary? Sure. Sure. Yep. All right. Well, if you'd like to go in and read in Exodus and Leviticus and all Numbers and all of that, you'd be able to find that. But those were set requirements that were made by the Jewish people. That was handed down to Moses, that they carried that through. And there were strict requirements on what was good or what was bad. What do you think the purpose of that would have been? Sure. Doves. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. Don? Ben, you're an old law scholar, but I think the fact that they could buy from here would allow, it doesn't seem to necessarily say that I have to provide my own. Whatever way I could get it, I would be able to get it, right? Yeah. Well, I think it's fair. I think you can look at this and absolutely see sort of a skirting by, as doing as maybe as little as you have to do, which goes against the idea of sacrifice. Then, yes, it's the fact that there's 100 people in line to do it. Yeah, Deb. Sure, sure. It's costing you something. That sure, sure. Uh huh. Right. 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 Sure. 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 Mm-hmm. Sure. You don't have to buy it. Yeah. You don't have to pay it. This is from, this is where we see it in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16. Ben, do you care to read this, sir? It's a little longer, but.
This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall be. A half shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 germs. A half shekel shall be offered to the Lord. Everyone including among those who are numbered, from 20 years old and up, shall give an offering to the Lord. The rich shall not give more, the poor shall not give less than half a shekel. When you give an offering to the Lord, you make an atonement for yourself. And you shall take the atonement for the children of Israel, and shall appoint it for the service of the tabernacle of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord. Make atonement for yourself.
And so this was the requirement that's there. When we talk about things like taxes, if you pay income taxes, well, if somebody makes $100,000 a year and somebody makes $20,000 a year, you're going to fall into a different tax bracket. But that same person goes to the store and buys a Coke, they're going to pay the same sales tax whether you're a billionaire or whether you don't have more than $2. And this is what it is. We see with Ben, they were required, everyone over 20 years of age, this was a requirement that they had to be able to pay. So it probably was, in this case, more challenging for people who were poor than for those people who would have been rich. But I wanted us to see where they were drawing back. And really everything that we see when it comes to sacrifice, when it comes to requirements for Passover feast and all these things, they all come out of the book of Exodus. And they're all things that were assigned to the people as they were leaving Egypt. Any other questions about that, Mary? Well, it's perhaps a cynical approach to it, I get, but also wasn't the whole fault of the whole old law was that it becomes a checklist of things to do, and sincerity sort of falls out the window. I can't do this, I can't do that. We talked about that a few weeks back about the Sabbath day. And they sort of made the rules up sort of as they went. Well, you can carry, this is light enough, but this is too heavy, kind of a thing. I think that I understand exactly what you're saying. And we see that sort of nailed to the cross with Jesus, that sacrifice asks something different of us. Yes. Yes. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Yeah. Yep. Right.
I think the sincerity is no different than us today.
Sure.
If you don't put no effort, no thought into it, you just give the bare minimum, you get by with your conscience with it, then it can be insincere.
Mm-hmm.
When you really study and meditate on what you're giving and give from the heart, give willingly and lovingly, sacrificially to God, then I think it's the same for them. We put ourselves in their shoes.
Right.
They may be just paying some money, but if it's from the heart and love, devotion to God, then it's not just.
Sure. Sure. Uh-huh. So I don't know if you heard what Maria was saying right there, but she has the Jewish folks that live, I guess, live close to you and around you and friends with you and whatever, and they were restricted as to what they would be able to do. For instance, turn the stove on or turn the television on, but they go to their neighbor or yell at their neighbor next door or whatever who's not Jewish to come over and push this button, can you turn, and so not a lot of sincerity necessarily in that as well. All right, I told you we go to Mark 11, and we need to go to Mark 11, so let's go to Mark 11 right now. This is Mark chapter 11. We're going to read verses 15 through 17 to start with. Tony, do you care to read this? Okay. Connie, you want to read verses 18 and 19 then? All right. So we have a few questions here to consider on what we just read. First of all, we read in Mark 11 and verse 15. Jesus and his disciples come to Jerusalem, and Jesus enters the temple and does a few things. First of all, who does he cast out from the temple? All right. He cast out those, it says, that bought and sold in the temple. So he was frustrated with kind of the whole crew. Absolutely. It wasn't necessarily just the merchandisers, but the participants in that as well. Who does he overthrew whose tables? Overthrew the tables of the money changers and overthrew whose seats? Those that sold doves. And so the level of frustration here seems to be rather high. And Ben's mentioned that a couple of times right here. Not only that, I think what Connie read, or maybe it was Tony in verse 16, he also didn't allow any man to carry what through the temple? It said wares. I don't know if we use the word wares that much anymore, but what does it mean there? They weren't allowed to carry their wares through the temple. The stuff they had for sale. Not only are we not selling, you can't back the truck up, load it all in, and haul it through here as you do as well. Why would he say that? This is strictly opinion, but why would he say that? It's It's a little bit of a. I looked at this sort of like as an enticement, or look at all the stuff that they're hauling in here. If you ever been to Walmart and they're unloading the stuff I would never look at any of that stuff, but you look at it like I could use all of those things right there. Well, the same kind of thing perhaps happens right here. Jesus prevented the people from using the temple as a thoroughfare for any type of commercial activity. Commercial activities can quickly take the place of religious activities. Commercial activities replace religious activities even today. We still see that happen, where the church becomes more commercial than it does religious. Sure. Absolutely. Sure. Sure. Wow. It's a good timely reference there of a 95-year-old man who's probably been dead for 30 years right there. We all know Richard Burton. Actually, y'all probably all do. Wasn't he married to Elizabeth Taylor, maybe? All right. Jesus in Mark chapter 11 and verse 17, it's probably written in italics. He quotes two Old Testament prophets. I want us to read both of these. You get a little narrower version of this in Mark 11 and 17. But if we look first at the first one, Isaiah 56 and verse 7. Jill, do you care to read that one? So Isaiah says it shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. So in a sense, that's what the temple should be, right? Jeremiah 7 and verse 11, I think what Don read just a minute ago. Leland, do you care to read Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 11? And so Jesus takes sort of these two scriptures and merges them together and says what it should be. It's a house of prayer, right? It should be a place to come and worship. It should be a place to come and sacrifice. It should be a place where I've spent my time. I know I have to go here for the Passover feast. I'm taking my stuff. I'm prepared for it. This is going to cost me. This is going to be a challenge, but that's what it should be. Instead, Jeremiah 7:11, has it not become a den or a place of thieves right there? And so Jesus quotes both of these, and we see it quite often in the New Testament, in the four Gospels, that Jesus, a lot of times the words that Jesus says aren't the words of Jesus, right? They're words that were uttered or written by prophets hundreds or maybe even, well, probably not thousands, but hundreds of years ahead of time. Thoughts on these two verses? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Uh, excuse me. We've seen this then in Mark chapter 11 and verse 18, what we read just a moment ago. What reason did the chief priests and the scribes want to destroy Jesus? What was the word that was used? They feared him. Okay. I don't think the word fear was what the chief priest and the scribes felt at the start of Jesus' time. Probably more annoyance with Jesus to start with. So why do you think it has went from maybe annoyance or aggravation, maybe even curiosity? Who is, Nicodemus came to him sort of out of this setting, like, how does this all work? How do you think it went from annoyance or curiosity to they sought to destroy him because of fear? Okay. Many more people. Is that what you were going to say? Uh-huh. So these more and more people are following these. He's not spouting stuff off like we see right there. He's quoting Jeremiah and he's quoting Isaiah. They're not just making things up, but he's saying things with truth to them. Yes, ma'am. Sure. It's hard to hide that, right? Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about they wanted to do what to Lazarus? They wanted to kill him, which would say, now Jesus didn't. There he is dead. That would negate what, because you're going to be convinced by a man brought back from the dead. But if he's laying there dead, you're like, well, it didn't happen, or he wasn't really dead in the first place, or whatever. They were anything they could, scheming in any way to try and eliminate or trying to knock down the power that Jesus had. Go ahead. Yeah, sure. They didn't seem too worried about the money changers. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. You're not gonna win. Sure. 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 After the evening comes, the last thing that Connie read there a moment ago, where did Jesus go? What a day, right? What a day. So I want you to imagine that you had been, you, you may have known Jesus. You may have been, you may not have really known Jesus at all. But you see all of this. Wonder what your reaction to all of this would be. Let's get out of here. Yeah. Right. Right. Anybody else? What might you have been thinking? Yeah. Sure. And kind of going back to what Mary said at the beginning, even this becomes like a rote thing that you do. We go there for Passover, we make these sacrifices, but this hadn't happened before. And so maybe it opens your mind up to sort of a different way of thinking. Like, I've always just assumed that that they're going to be there. Like, I guess they should be there. There's many things in our life that we just sort of assume that should happen. We do this lesson with students about the national anthem. Why do we play national anthem before a ball game? We've always done, but I didn't ask custom. I said, why? They don't play it before you go to the movies. It's like, here comes a Richard Burton movie. All right, let's play. That's when they only had 48 stars on the flag. But anyway, they don't play the national anthem right there. If they played the national anthem before you watched the movie tonight, you would say, that's the stupidest thing they've ever done. But when they play, but we think about things, sometimes things become customary. The reason that they did is they started in 1918 during the World Series, but we don't have time for that. But we become sort of custom now. But when you saw the Moneychangers, every year we went, they're over there changing money. They're robbing us blind, but we got to do it. But now, as you said, Maria, now somebody's sort of challenged that. They've seen that. Like you said, Ben, somebody might have said, finally, somebody took care of that. And so when you go home, your thoughts going home are, well, that's why different. They make a valid point in why they did that. Sure. They'd read that Bible harder than they ever have before, trying to find where that's not where it says that there in the scriptures. I want to go to John chapter 2 real quick. You go to John chapter 2 with me if you don't mind. But John chapter 2, which I said at the beginning, we're going to be spending most of our time at the end of Gospels. But John chapter 2 is quite literally at the very beginning of what happens. But in John chapter 2, starting in verse 13, my Bible says Jesus cleanses the temple. This story is really similar. In fact, there's debate on this story, and I don't really know which side I fall on this debate. First of all, I've said several times that Bible history is not necessarily written the way that we write history today. We write history chronologically. Bible history is not necessarily always written chronologically. And so there is debate because this story, we're going to read this should sound almost exactly like what we just read at the end of Mark, okay? And what you would read at the end of Matthew and at the end of Luke. And so there's question about, did Jesus cleanse the temple twice? Or did Jesus cleanse the temple once? And is the story just told in a different spot in John versus in the other three Gospels? I will proclaim no answer. I will leave that entirely up to you as to what it would be. I have thoughts on it, but I'll let you consider those, and you can make your own decision. I don't know that it matters, but I think you can. I'll let you think about it here as we go. But Tom, the principle is the same. And what I really want you to see right here is when we get done with this, I want you to say, wait, we already talked about that. Tom, do you care to read John 2, 13 through 17? Boo, do you care to read 18 to 22? All right. So if we want to call this the first cleansing of the temple, we can do it that way. Just real quick on some things that we saw there. It's very similar to what we had read, especially the first handful of verses that Tom read. According to John, Jesus cleansed another time very early in his ministry. Why had Jesus gone to Jerusalem in John chapter 2 and verse 13? It was Passover. But Jesus' ministry lasts for 3 years, and Passover happens every year. So it's reasonable to think that multiple Passovers would have come during this time. Who does Jesus find in the temple in John 2 and verse 14? Okay. Those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, right? That's just what we saw just a moment ago. What does Jesus do then? Okay. Said he made a whip of cords. Then he did what? Drove out what? Drove them out of the temple along with the sheep and oxen, it said. Poured out the what? Poured out the through the temple. And then last, what? Take these things away, right? House of what? House of mercy. Does that story sound familiar? So I'll leave it up to you. I don't know if it's a repeat story. It feels like if you did it once, a couple years later, they wouldn't have been shot by it, but I don't know. It's entirely, again, I don't think it really matters what Don said there just a minute ago, that the same sort of thoughts were in Jesus' head. But as somebody who's taught school for a long time, you tell them not to do something, then the next day they do, even though we went over it yesterday, they still do. So sometimes we can fuss about things and it still doesn't necessarily take. I really want to go to the latter part, what Boo read there just a moment ago. At this action of Jesus, his disciples remembered something that had been written in Psalm 69:9. What had the psalmist said as quoted in John chapter 2 and verse 17? Zeal for your house has eaten me up. And so when the Jews asked for a sign, what did Jesus answer them? So you're at the temple. Think back to that picture that we looked at from the beginning. Think back to other pictures of the temple we've seen, what Ben has presented in his classes as well. That is a big place. This church is not the temple. The temple way bigger than anything that we're setting in right. This is a small house compared to what the temple would have been. So Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, most of y'all, probably about like me, you're probably smarter than me about this, the ability to build a home, right? I don't know anything about building a home. But I know something that's big. I'm going to look at that and say, it's probably going to take a while to build that. When somebody says, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it back, what do you think the people's thoughts were? That's crazy. That doesn't make sense, right? Mathematically, that doesn't make sense. We can't build this. First of all, it'd take 3 days to tear it down and longer. We aren't going to be able to build this back. Remember, they said they'd asked for a sign. How long had the temple been under construction? John chapter 2 and verse 20. Or they've been, essentially what we say, they've been building on that thing forever, right? There's no way you can get it done in a weekend. But what was Jesus talking about? He was talking about the temple of his body. But how long would it be? I guess we can go ahead and do that. How long was it before they realized what he had been talking about? Not until after he was raised. So I want us to go back to kind of what Mary was talking about to finish up tonight. The old law sort of required you to think about things in a concrete, physical way. The law said, I need to have these sheep, and I need to have these oxen, and I need to give this hard coin. And if I don't have this hard coin, I have to exchange it with another hard coin that allows me to get the one that I want. The temple that we spend our life going to for Passover and for our culture and for our social and for our religious reasons, this hard physical building that in many cases it's almost as if they came and worshiped. That all gets done away with by what Jesus will be teaching, which is a genuine sacrifice, a sacrifice that's not graspable for most humans. The willingness to go and die on a cross so that I could help you. See, I totally have no problem killing a cow or killing a sheep, getting a little bit of money to give. But if you're asking me to die, that's a bridge too far. But what Jesus is saying here is that he is going to do that. And he's going to be torn down. But in 3 days, it's going to be risen back up. So the kingdom of Jesus would be far greater than any building made of sticks or stones. Sure. Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm. Sure. Other thoughts? Yes. Right.
I don't understand fully what the fact is. They believed it and they pressed on and they hung on to Jesus even though they didn't understand what the problem is. Things that happen. That's the lesson for us. We don't understand it. We just don't understand it.
Sure. Anybody else? Thank you.